Even though China's factory output is growing, a broader recovery across the region remains elusive. Manufacturing surveys suggest Asia's factory pain deepened in May. The slump in global trade caused by the pandemic worsened, with export powerhouses Japan and South Korea suffering the sharpest declines. Japan's factory activity shrank at the fastest pace since 2009. South Korea also saw manufacturing slump at the sharpest pace in more than a decade. Taiwan's manufacturing also fell. Manufacturing activity, that is. India's factory activity contracted sharply, extending the major decline seen in April. Vietnam, Malaysia and the Philippines saw some rebound from April, but the indices remain below the 50 threshold that separates contraction from expansion. Manufacturing PMI in these countries hit their record lows in April as both external and domestic demand were hit by the COVID-19 lockdowns. Now, for more on this, we can take a closer look on these surveys, what they're telling us, with Rajiv Biswas. He is the APAC chief economist at IHS Markit. Rajiv, thanks for joining us. Firstly, when we look at the survey results, a key weakness that still plagues many Asian countries is lackluster export demand, no surprise perhaps, even for China, which reported the best showing. So how long is export demand likely to stay weak for Asia, do you think?
Well, what we're seeing basically is the impact of the severe global slump. We're seeing very severe contractions in the economies in the US and also the EU during the second quarter because of the impact of their lockdowns across most of Europe, as well as in many parts of the US. So all of that is hitting export orders in Asia very hard. So what we're seeing is the export sectors of many economies in East Asia are taking quite a hammering from this slump in world export orders. So I think what we're seeing in April and also in May, and probably the whole of the second quarter, is going to be quite a battering for Asia's export sector, even though we are starting to see improving domestic orders in some countries, particularly led by mainland China. But also there's, gradual improvement in other countries. We saw some better numbers in Malaysia and Thailand for May as their lockdowns were eased. I think when we look at the second half of the year, with lockdowns now being eased across most of Europe in June and the US likely to follow soon, we should start to see a gradual improvement in export orders coming through in the third quarter and improving momentum by the fourth quarter. So I think we're probably seeing the trough now for export orders in the second quarter, and then perhaps a very gradual improvement in the third quarter and better momentum in the fourth quarter of this year. We are expecting quite strong improvement in export orders for 2021 as US growth and European growth improve. And also, of course, China, we think, will show quite a strong rebound next year.
Rajiv, I want to speak about the US and China and their deteriorating relations. How would this affect their trade relations and China's PMI specifically?
Well, clearly the US is a key export market for China. And as we saw in 2019, the trade frictions between the US and China had quite a negative impact on Chinese exports. It's not clear yet how that will play out this year. Obviously, there was a trade deal put in place to try to overcome some of the bilateral problems before the pandemic took off. But now we're obviously seeing a new escalation, at least in the rhetoric between US and China. So how that then plays out into trade is still unclear. I think the biggest problem right now for China is the actual weakness of the US economy, where there's been a severe contraction in economic activity in the second quarter. So that clearly will hit Chinese exports to the US because of the lockdowns in the US. And even in the third quarter of this year, the US recovery is probably going to be relatively gradual because there's a huge number of people who have become unemployed in the US. So that will be hurting consumer demand. So until the number of jobless starts to come down, that will take quite a toll on export orders for China. So I think the most important concern for China is really how quickly will the US economy recover? And of course, if there are additional trade measures placed on China, that would be a additional negative factor that could affect the outlook in the near term anyway.
Yeah, so staying with the worsening US-China ties then, the knock-on effect will also be similar, do you think, for South Korea, Taiwan and Japan, particularly as their PMIs continue to drop in May?
I think we are going to see weakness in the PMIs in the second quarter. So perhaps even in June, there'll still be this effect of the lockdowns in the US and Europe, which has hit their domestic consumer demand because their stores are closed or have been until very recently. So consumers, even if they wanted to buy electronics or clothing items, were not really able to do that. Now that Europe is reopening in quite a rapid way, we should start to see improvement from June onwards, and probably momentum improving in the summer in Europe and also the US. So that should start to help countries like South Korea, which obviously export a lot of autos, a lot of electronics. So as consumer electronics demand starts to improve and auto dealers reopen across the world, that will help to boost South Korean exports. For Taiwan, it's a similar sort of picture. They're a huge exporter of electronics. So until the electronics sector starts to get a rebound in consumer demand, they're probably going to have a difficult time in June, but improving in the third quarter and fourth quarter of this year, particularly hopefully into a better Christmas season as consumers in Europe and the US kind of get over the pandemic woes. Of course, Japan now has also ended its state of emergency, so activity in Japan in the third quarter should also start to improve. So all of those things do indicate that probably Q2, the current quarter, was the trough for East Asia in terms of exports and also in terms of domestic demand, because many countries in Asia also had lockdown. And that third quarter should start to be an improvement, and fourth quarter building momentum. And for most of East Asia, we do expect a relatively good recovery in 2021.
Thank you so much, Rajiv, for speaking to us. Rajiv Biswa, the APEC Chief Economist at IHS Markit.